Ladies and gentlemen, happening in this venue right now is a presentation by Payments Association of South Africa CEO Gita Erling, titled A New Payments Industry Body, and asking the question of will it and can it change the landscape? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back onto the stage the CEO of PASA, Gita Erling.
So I almost feel like I need to start off with this by apologizing, because a lot of what I'm going to be doing is taking you through what is it that we do today, what is the story to get to what is going to be different in the future. So we are going to go through a little bit of who are we, what are we doing, and then we can get into the how does it change. And I promise you I will answer the question, will the world be different, which I think it will be very different at the end of this. So, what does PASA do today? So we break down our functions into 4 different areas that we look after. The first is we effectively a self-regulatory body that manages the payment systems. We talk about 18 payment systems. I find it difficult to keep track because we seem to close them quite regularly, having closed NADO and ADO in the last couple of years and checks in the years before that, and also opening new payment systems like PayShop. But what do? We agree the rules, we monitor risk, we deal with non-compliance issues, we actually do all of the admittance, licensing, and authorizations of the parties who participate in those payment systems, and we consider various risk elements that come out of the interoperability world. We also, along with a bunch of other people in the country, play a role in strategy. So I wouldn't say it all sits within the PASA environment. There's obviously national strategy that comes out of the Reserve Bank. We spoke about Vision 2025 this morning. There's work that gets done in various associations from more of a trade commercial point of view, but we pull all of that together into the roadmaps as to how these various payment streams are going to develop. Quite critical in that has been, and we heard about it earlier, the work that we're doing around modernization of payment systems. By their very nature of being interoperable, payment systems mean that sometimes everybody has to move at once. And again, we touched on that quite significantly in the previous panel. We do quite a lot of project management and implementation work just to make sure that everybody does move at the same time and that we move in tandem without losing the interoperability. And then finally, and here I have to agree with Steve, I think one of our biggest challenges by far as an industry is around capability and skills, is we do some capacity building, training, education, and even running conferences like today's. I remain concerned that we don't do enough there. We do certification training courses, but what makes payments practitioners is actually doing payments. And we're of the view that we need to do a lot more in order to make that happen. So that is the PASA of today. What prompted all of this change is in fact a change to the regulatory landscape. And we'll talk about that in a couple of slides' time. But before I get there, I just want to pull together a conceptual picture of all of the parties who play in our current landscape. So at the top, we have the National Payments System Act, which is an act that effectively belongs to the Reserve Bank, empowers the National Payment System Department, and they then license PASA as a payment system management body. Underneath that, we have a whole bunch of public regulations. So in the Twin Peaks construct, we have the South African Reserve Bank, who looks after the prudential piece as well as the payment systems. But we have the conduct piece that sits under the Financial Sector Conduct Authority. Then from the bottom up, we have a whole alphabet soup of various trade associations who really have quite a fundamental part to play in this industry, both as users and providers of payment systems, but whose businesses are significantly impacted by what happens in the self-regulatory environment. And I'm not going to even attempt to go through that alphabet soup other than to say Many of them are in the room today, so we're very grateful that they're here. And increasingly, we're starting to see coordination, particularly across the non-bank payment association or the non-bank trade associations through the PSSF, which for us is very encouraging. Now, somehow to get all of this to work, you've got in the middle, in the green, all of the parties who play a role. So there's clearing participants, there's scheme operators, clearing operators, fintechs, our South African terminology around system operators, third-party payment providers, retailers, collectors, and you've got to hold all of that together so that it doesn't fragment too much. And that's where we talk about the red piece, which is the middle mile of interoperable payments. So somehow holding together all of these different parties in a coherent way, even though, as we heard from Ryan this morning, the ways that they choose to integrate payments into their ecosystem might be completely different, they still have to ultimately talk to the same payment system. And this conceptual slide is the slide that we use to justify the fact that there is still a need for some kind of private sector, self-regulatory body that pulls this whole ecosystem of different parties together in a coherent and sensible way. So why the regulatory reform that we're seeing in this country? And there have been, in my view, 4 drivers of what has made this happen. The first is around access, and this has been spoken about by the Reserve Bank quite a lot, which is creating a regulatory framework that is actually based, to my last point, on activity rather than institution. So far greater direct involvement of non-banks into the payment system. The second is around licensing. So you'll remember I mentioned that PASE effectively grants access into the payment system. We license the clearing operators, we authorize the system operators, we register third-party payment providers, and we're the ones who actually give participants access to the system. And there is a strong view that competitors should not actually be licensing other competitors. So best governance practice is that the licensing of payment participants should sit with the regulator. We also have this slightly strange situation, and I think there are very good historic reasons for how it arose, which is that the Reserve Bank runs the real-time gross settlement system, but we write the rules for how it works. So part of what's changing is a view that says settlement rules must sit with the settlement operator. And then finally, as I think is happening in a number of different jurisdictions, is this move to activity-based regulation. So it actually doesn't matter who you are, it matters what you're doing. And that, for all that the access conversation might feel threatening to the traditional players, this activity-based regulation conversation is actually very important, because it means that you don't have shadow systems running on the side that are playing to a different level of regulation to what your typical bank, who was the previous regulated entity, was. So this activity-based regulation, and we see that the non-bank communities are starting to understand this, brings in a much bigger regulatory overhead for parties who have not been part of the system. So it does level the playing fields to quite a large extent. So in this context of the regulatory reform, when the position papers first came out, and it's now a number of years ago, it's probably 6, 7 years ago, talking about changes to the National Payment System Act to give effect to this, there was a big discussion about do we need a PAS or don't we? Do we not just move the clearing rules to the clearing operators and let everybody get on with it? And in fact, it was precisely this conceptual model that got us to the point where we said, we still do need somebody who pulls it all together. So what is the payments industry body? We put together this little preamble which introduces our design report on this topic, but is actually worth spending a minute or two reading and going through. And the main author of it, thank you, Sydney, is sitting in the audience. But I am going to read through it because I think it's quite an important point that the NPS, the National Payment System, is made up of interoperable systems and the associated network effects. And we've talked about the network effects today in a number of the sessions. And those drive the national policy objectives around safety, security, interoperability, efficiency, financial inclusion, competition, all those good things that we've been talking about today, that this utility underpinning the national payment system or the economy creates for all of us. So what we have recognized in designing the payments industry body is that in order to be relevant, we need all of the parties who provide payment services to be in the net, to be part of the same ecosystem, to prevent the fragmentation so that there aren't 3 different QR codes and 3 different POS machines when you walk in to pay at the retailer, but also to leverage the power of all these exciting new things that we're doing. We spoke about data in combating fraud. We spoke about the power of the digitalization and trying to bring these dual economies together. And we believe really firmly that this depends not just on the traditional players who've been part of the ecosystem, but in bringing in a much broader community of payment system providers. And therefore, an inclusive payment industry body needed to be designed to meet all of those requirements. It's been quite interesting to me listening to the numbers of direct participants that the various payment industry bodies who have sat on the stage today talk to. You know, we hear 17 here and 14 there. We're already, for a country our size, sitting on quite a number at 36. We already have a number of non-banks who have been designated directly into the clearing system and who are members and in many cases up and functioning within the PASA environment, and in a number of cases are fintechs. So on a case-by-case basis, we've already seen the move to greater inclusion. This goes a step further, and it says anybody who is providing out of quite a long list of payment services that cover pretty much everything you could think of is going to be licensed in a future regime and will need to be part of a payments industry body. And then, most critical, PASA is the sum of its members. We don't sit with all the expertise in the center. When it comes to managing and governing these payment systems, it's all the representatives from the various participants who sit in the room with all of the expertise. And what PASA has the process and the expertise to be able to facilitate that and to make it happen. And all of that existing know-how, existing systems, the rules, processes, the regulatory frameworks should not be lost. And nor should all of the expertise and capacity that is put into the room by our various stakeholders. It's critical to hold on to that as well. So having set ourselves these objectives, we then also got a set of objectives from our regulator. And the Reserve Bank asked the industry to go away and design a new payments industry body that would ensure the best interests of the national payment system are served, that we achieve and maintain interoperability, that we support our regulators and all the regulatory authorities in making sure we have a safe and efficient national payment system. And for me, that talks to not losing the skill and the expertise that all of us collectively bring together, and that we continue to contribute to the national strategy and the national policy goals. And in asking us to do this, and you can see this request was made in 2021, they asked PASA as the experts in running the space to go away and to facilitate the design of the body that will ultimately replace PASA once all of these regulatory reforms that we've been talking about come into play. And off we went. So we thought this was going to be a 3-month process. Yeah, so these stats are worth reflecting on for a moment or two, because they talk both to the inclusiveness of the process and, in fact, the credibility of the exercise that we went through. In many respects, we were lucky that it happened during COVID. It's the second time someone's standing on the stage and talking about lucky that things happened during COVID. But the ability to do this with a very large online community was crucial. Our average attendance at most of our workshops was kind of in the 120 to 150 individuals. To manage a room full of people that size, doing meaningful design work would always have been very challenging. And so this slide just tells you the story of what we did. We went away and we looked at what a number of other jurisdictions were doing. We put together the full universe of what any payments association we could find does anywhere. We got some of our colleagues who've spoken to you today to come and talk to us in that process around how their worlds work, having already embarked on this. We had to do a massive education exercise. So that's probably the piece that stopped it from being a 3-month exercise and turned it into more like an 11-month exercise, is that we very quickly realized we don't all speak the same language and have the same mental models. And even with some of the largest participants in the space who have been payments participants for decades, don't have a visibility of what other people are doing closer to the fringe and how they interact with the national payment system. So we spent significant amounts of time just developing common language, common mental models, and the basis to even be able to have a meaningful and nuanced conversation around what a new payment industry body should look like. So 10 workshops, 12 workshop days, 55 workshop hours, more than 1,000 pages of slides, 21,000 emails in our various engagements with the parties. We put in place a very formal process of consulting. So we generated a series of viable options for our market. We would consult with the whole group. We would break people into smaller groups to work through the details and get to grips with them. Once we'd done a couple of iterations like that, we would go and formally ask for a sign-off of that component. And we iterated through this process until we got to the point where, and you can pick it up on our website, but we do have the link in this presentation, where we produced a report, I think it's a couple of 100 pages long, that outline the design of our future body that we could then hand over to the Reserve Bank as a response to their request for us to go and design this new entity. You could ask, given PASA's 27-year history and the effective role that it has played in the South African economy, why did we feel the need to go away and do all of this? And the really critical point for us was that this was not just opening PASA up to a whole new community of participants. This was all of us sitting down and saying, what are the different things that we want to get out of this, and how do we find that balance? And I like to think that we got to the right balance of everybody being equally unhappy, in that not everybody got everything they wanted out of it, but I think we have landed at a feasible design that can take the country forward. And the very good news, in fact, since I put this presentation together, or very shortly before I put this presentation together, was we got a no objection to the design from the Reserve Bank. Yeah. And what that no objection means is more than just simply, we like what you guys are doing, go away and do it, which they do say in that letter. But it was also an acknowledgement that we have built in the necessary enabling provisions into the incoming legislation that will both allow the transition to this new entity and will give it the regulatory recognition and the powers that it needs in order to do what it needs to do. I am not going to bore you with taking you through the full design. This is just a bit of an overview conceptual model of what it is that we covered in putting together the design. And if there's one thing that was really critical in guiding us is we started with design principles. And okay, aside from funding and member rights and obligations, that was probably one of the areas where we spent the longest time, was getting into a common view of what it is from a principle point of view that we wanted. And then when we got into the detail, we could, of course, apply the principles. So the various components that we covered in putting this thing together go from what kind of recognition does it need in law, what kind of mandate does it need from its members. So PASA today sits with a very strong member mandate, running conferences like this, the training that we do, quite a lot of the strategy work that we do, but we equally sit with a regulatory mandate. And the regulatory mandate is in preventing the fragmentation. It's in being able to say local rules apply and we overrule international card schemes, and this is how things will run in South Africa. We went through, as I said earlier, a massive exercise of determining what should the functions be. With the help of our researchers, we drew up this whole big list of what everyone else in the world does, and we said who in South Africa should do it, and worked from there. We then said what scope do those functions apply to? And I must say that the scope rather worries me because it is very aspirational relative to our capacity. And even if we were given unlimited money, back to the skills conversation, we couldn't possibly build the capacity to do everything that everybody wants us to do on day one. We looked at governance, so what is the board structure, how is the board appointed? We looked at membership, member rights and obligations, and we also looked at how we are funded. So there's different categories of membership. So what you get to vote on is very much based on, and to pick a phrase again from one of our colleagues from a sister organization, how much skin you have in the game. So if you don't participate in clearing, you won't write interoperability rules that relate to clearing. And we looked at the various structures where the work will get done. So what does all of this mean? Now that we've gone through the whole story of what did we do, how did we get here, to answer the exam question about, well, does this mean that the world is going to be any different? So the so what, obviously, is the new regulatory architecture, and we've already touched on that. So the Reserve Bank will license all participants, all service providers in the national payment system. We've seen a draft of the various activities that will be licensed. It is very comprehensive. It goes as far as including frameworks which are not currently existent in this country. So parties who haven't been near the payment system, including some facets of open banking, domestic remittance providers, all of the mobile money providers who up until now have depended on their partner bank will now have to also be licensed in their own right. The Conduct Authority will also license everybody who deals directly with consumers. So most of these parties are going to require dual licensing. What is quite encouraging is that the Reserve Bank and the Fiscus seem to be working together on this, so hopefully it's not going to be a dual application process. As I mentioned, the activities to be licensed include things that we haven't previously seen in the regulatory net in this country. The settlement rules move to the settlement operator. This next point around writing rules for their members, for schemes and clearing operators, is actually a huge point. So the legal underpinning of the rules that we write today is what we call payment clearinghouse agreements. So all of the participants within a given payment stream have signed multilateral agreements to which we are, by the way, not a party, which then bind them to the clearing rules. So there is a strong argument to say that much of what we do today is based on contractual arrangements between participants. In terms of the new Act, both schemes and operators will write binding rules without us having to have that multilateral agreement, and I'll come to that in a little bit more detail. Because the way that the Reserve Bank plans to give effect to giving the payments industry body the ability to write rules that supersede those of schemes, so back to the local rules apply, and of clearing operators, so the ability to enforce interoperability between different clearing operators. And we heard the conversation just now about the US, where you've got two different providers of real-time payment systems and no plan for them to interoperate. The PIB will, in terms of the way that it will be licensed and the enabling clauses in the Act, be able to write rules that force that. So in some respects, in fact, greater powers than what PASA sits with today. So very significant regulatory change to the architecture in this country. The other obviously massive change is the new categories of licensed participants, all of whom, as part of their licensing conditions, if they play within the interoperable space, will be required to be members of the PIB. Now that raises a whole host of interesting topics, which we will briefly touch on. The first is that rights and obligations are very closely tied to how much risk do you take and bring into the payment system. So if you're not participating in clearing, you will not have a vote on rules that relate to interoperability in clearing. What other members will have that they don't have today is the right to be consulted when they are impacted by those rules, which is actually quite a big administrative change, because it means you've got to talk to a far greater community of people, not just the 17 or 36 who are actually providing the service. We've gone a step further, and this is probably quite unique in most of these organizations, and allowed for voluntary membership of parties who are not licensed, but who have a legitimate interest in the activities of the payments industry body and the way in which it will affect them. We anticipate that quite a lot of that will be through associations. So this is going to be a whole new game. We're going to learn lots from our counterparts who already have associations of members, as members, but in entirely different space to the one that we find ourselves in at the moment. And by our calculations, we start talking about a member base, just based on the people that we register and authorize today, of add a zero to our kind of 36 today, and possibly even higher. So we're suddenly dealing with a much, much bigger community of parties who have very different drivers. At least we'll have a more or less common licensing regime, so that will help, and with different commercial interests. So we as an organization are going to have to build some very sharp skills around working with such a big and diverse group of participants. And then changes to the industry roles, which is kind of one of the first things that everybody asks us about when we talk about this, which is why I have almost left it to the last point. So quite separate from the regulatory changes, we've had an agreement with Banks of Africa, and this has already played out in the PayShop environment, that the scheme management sits with the operator of the scheme. So what has happened historically is that the product development has actually sat within the PASA environment, while the people who run the products have had to come to us for the product development. And over the last few years, we've agreed that that probably doesn't make sense, that the product development and the scheme sits with the operator. And you'll have seen that play out with PayShop, where the PayShop scheme sits with Banks of Africa, but we have written PASA rules. And the PASA rules should be written so that if another scheme operator in real-time payments comes in, they can come in and play by the same rules, and we can have an interoperable across potentially multiple scheme or multiple operator solution. As I say, this is not the regulatory change. This is a business decision that we've made as an industry. It does have some implications for our debit order, direct debit, whatever you want to call it, environment, where we will now need to separate the scheme from the more interoperability rules. So today we have one set of, we call them authenticated collection rules, which provide the DebiCheck solution, and PASA has kind of trademarked DebiCheck, but actually DebiCheck is probably the scheme. That would move to Banks of Africa, authenticated collections, and the associated registered mandate service. The interoperability rules relating to that would remain within PASA and ultimately the PIB. The other big change is that today What we would do if you want to come into the card clearing environment, for example, is we would ask for your MasterCard and or your Visa certification, depending on what role you are playing. But then we would be the ultimate party who would sign off that you can participate in that environment. In the new model, we won't do that at all. It'll be up to the individual scheme or the individual operator to admit and allow their participants to go live. So actually quite a big reorganization of how this industry has traditionally worked. Will this change the industry landscape, or is this just kind of reorganizing a few deck chairs? So we have heard on platforms like this one, the Reserve Bank say multiple times that they envisage a scenario where non-banks could also participate in settlement without the support of a sponsor bank. When you layer that into all these new categories of licensing activities and accepting that settlement will be one of those licensed activities and that licensing will not just be limited to traditional players, obviously within a regulatory framework, you come out with an environment that could be very significantly different to what we look like today. And that, together with all these new participants, is perhaps why the PIB role and retaining that interoperability, making sure that the centre holds, and that it's not only about clearing standards, which you would have all heard during the course of today in the talk of API standards, QR codes, etc., is going to be so critical. It does, though, mean that we're going to have to evolve very different ways of working. I guess to some extent we already piloted them in that massive exercise we did in designing the new entity. But the challenge that we have is how do you manage the broad consultation while still keeping the industry moving forward? And again, you heard quite a lot of talk about that this morning, 5 years to reach agreement and then 5 years to implement. In fairness, we've probably been a little bit better than that when it came to our new real-time payment system. But the point is we cannot have those timelines stretch out. If anything, they've got to shorten. And so how do we manage that balance between consultation and keeping the industry moving forward? I do think coalitions of the willing on specific topics are going to be very critical. And while I fully agree with Steve that it is all about the process, and it is all about the process, we're already finding ourselves in a space where we are testing out different processes. We already have a number of the collectors sitting in our debit order environment, and we've had to create new structures for dealing with the different interests, sometimes in different rooms. We found with some of the other topics we've gotten involved in recently that it really helps to pull together a small focus group of absolute experts who are willing to put their time and energy into designing a new way forward before you take it into the formal structures. So we already, to some extent, are dabbling in new ways of working that will underpin, hopefully, a very different environment. The other piece, which was also touched on just now, is this increasing alignment between global, regional, and domestic payments standards. And what I really liked hearing about was this alignment between low-value and high-value payment standards as well. It's not something that I think we've done nearly enough of as a country. I think that it is going to become much bigger for us, especially for those of you who've been involved in the recent Common Monetary Area discussions, where the volumes don't actually justify bespoke payment systems. So to what extent can you use common standards, common payment systems on a regional basis? I also think, and this is not as the nature of the change, but I think what is being built into the change is much greater focus on financial crime, much greater focus on building cash into the strategy from day one. So yes, we've always been about digital alternatives, but also considering the cash piece of it. And how all of this works in a more kind of revolutionary world, I don't think we even know yet. So where to from here? So as I said, we're very happy to have received the no objection and the continued support for the establishment of this new entity and the expectation that we and the community will do now what is necessary in order to make this thing happen. However, current estimates are that the changes to the legislation that enable this are only going to land post the election next year, which means at best in the second half of next year. We don't know whether we'll be in a coalition government, a majority government. It might take a new parliament a while to find its feet. So there is considerable uncertainty in all of this around the timing of the change. And of course, that raises lots of challenges because the PASA employees are aware that their world is changing. And all of those people who sit on PASA structures and bring all that expertise in from our members also know that the world is changing. So we're having to spend big amounts of time with all of those parties, talking through the design, talking through the process, and actually just doing basic change resilience and change training, because we are going to be in this marathon for quite a while. There are also some design elements that it was too early to sign off when we did the design. That includes things like the founding documents of the entity, which will give force to the design. It includes the budget for day one, and tied to the budget is what will the entity actually do on day one? Because as I mentioned earlier, with the best will in the world, even if we had infinite money, we still wouldn't be able to hire all of the skills to do everything that's on that very aspirational list. And some various other elements where we will go back to the community and get sign-off. And we've always been very clear, if there's any change to the design, we will go back to the people who signed off on the design and get the change signed off. And I think we're about to go to the community with one of those in the next few months. And then we have developed a very detailed transition plan, which talks about how you move from one to the other. Big areas of uncertainty given the lack of timing, given that changes to the draft wording of the Act have still been in progress until quite recently. But at least we know what the triggers are for each piece of work and when we would get into it and what we need to do in that piece of work. So I'm going to open up to questions in some of the remaining time that we've got. But maybe just as a couple of concluding comments to say it's been the most incredible privilege to work with the community in this way. What we see often in other big projects of this nature is you start off with everybody in the room and then by the end of the conversation you're down to a tenth of the people. This has not been that experience at all. We maintain the participation levels throughout the 11 months. When we do updates to the industry now, we're still kind of averaging 150, 200 people on the call, and they're not all the same people from call to call. So there's still significant interest, and the challenge for us is going to be to keep that interest and involvement over the next couple of years. You can stay in touch with us on this. You can download the report. We do regular updates. If you want to be included in any of our update sessions, please just write to our email address on that, because this is going to be an evolving exercise, as it must be, over a couple of years of how we build this thing and make it work together. So on that note, and leaving up the contact details, which you're not seeing, I'm going to open up to questions. So I'm going to go and collect the iPad there with the Slido questions, and we'll go from there. Okay. And either there's a user problem or we don't have any questions coming through from the audience. There we go. Will the PASA still be recognized by the SARB the way that the PSMB was? So the answer to that one is that the enabling clauses for PASA, or the terms under which PASA gets recognized as a payment system body, is in the National Payment System Act as we sit today. So the concept of the payment system management body is in the Act. The new Act will not have a payment system management body concept in it at all. What it will have is enabling clauses that ultimately allow the Reserve Bank to license the PIB as a scheme of schemes, for want of a better word, that can write rules that override scheme and operator rules. So no, it won't be licensed in the same way that PASA was, but it will still be licensed and in many respects actually have greater powers to enforce interoperability. This feels like the introduction of even more bureaucracy. How does this ignite the payments landscape and make room for inclusion rather than regulate non-bank players? I think the simple answer to that is that if you're going to let non-banks in, you can only do it by regulating them. So this isn't throwing open the payment system as a free-for-all. There are still very foundational risks that need to be managed in the system. And Jane talked about it earlier when she said, we've had bank failures. How did we manage to keep that out of the payment system? We've spoken about fraud, we've spoken about fin crime. So those fundamental risks still exist in the payment system. And it cannot be that you participate in the payment system without having the same regulatory framework. So expect to be caught in the accountable institution type regulation. So yes, this is more regulation. Yes, we do know that there tends to be consolidation when industries become more regulated because it does create more of a governance and a regulatory burden and a cost for borderline entities. But it's a double-edged sword. At the same time, it also opens up the space with even playing fields so that everybody who wants to can play, provided they meet the minimum criteria. What additional internal capacity is being prioritized to fulfill the new entity mandate? We're a member-funded organization, so the answer to that one is, how much are you prepared to fund? No. But in all seriousness, what we do, and what I expect the PIB will continue to do, is to engage with its members around what are the priorities that you want us to do in any given year, and align those to our budget. So if we're working within a fixed capacity, then there's X amount of priorities that we can deliver. If you want more delivery out of us, then obviously the funding budget needs to go up. And I expect that the PIB will probably have to work on a very similar basis. Could there be more than one PIB? The answer is yes, in terms of what the regulation will allow. As today, there could actually be more than one payment system management body. So the regulation would allow it. But does it make sense to have more than one body whose ultimate role is about interoperability? Because then you would have to create interoperabilities across the bodies, and who does that? So practically and pragmatically, probably not. It's very unlikely. Would the regulation allow it? Yes. And I think with 3 minutes, that probably covers most of the questions that have been put forward. I am not going to keep you in your seats by talking for the next 3 minutes. You're very welcome to go and have your tea 3 minutes early. And from my side, just to say thank you for joining this, and I'm really looking forward to working with all of you on this journey.